And welcome everybody. So it's another NOVA Scribes. So for those of you that are new to NOVA Scribes, my name is Brian Tarallo. I'm one of the NOVA Scribes organizers. And a little bit about NOVA Scribes, we are a free and open forum for visual practitioners to share their knowledge. That means we are anybody who uses visuals to move others. That means consultants and facilitators who happen to use visuals, graphic recorders, scribes, sketchnoters, and we're all volunteer. So that means anybody who wants to can be an organizer or a presenter. And just so you know, the proceeds from all of our events go to the presenters or into the meetup for scholarships and help to build the community of visual practitioners. We have organized classes, graphic jams, open spaces, and webinars like this one in order to share skills and learn from each other. We record our webinars and post them for anyone to watch later. This one will be posted on in the meetup comments. You'll see a link to YouTube, whether you're a member or not. And so if you're interested in presenting a topic, please let us know. We organize our events using the meetup app. And if you haven't found us this way, you can find us by going to the meetup app and searching NOVA Scribes. So here's a quick overview of some events that are coming up. Our next meetup is actually, it hasn't been posted yet, but watch for it. It's going to be March 19th at 6 p.m. Yuri Malashenko, who is in Denmark these days, is going to be teaching visual thinking for problem solvers. And on April 22nd at 7 p.m., we're going to have Let's Get Digital, which is an intro to the wild world of digital scribing. And that's going to be presented by Aaron Gordon and Sarah DeWitt. I had to think about that for a second. Yeah, so let me tell you just a little bit about Kelvy from my perspective. She's got an amazing bio. I'm going to skip all that. I'm just going to tell you what my relationship is with her. I will say, of all of the visual practitioners who focus on seeing systems, I believe that Kelvy really is the master of the art of it. Because she doesn't like to plug her own book, I will. You got to check out generative scribing. I mean, it completely changed the way I listen. Not necessarily the way that I draw, but the way that I listen and the way that I look for systems dynamics underneath the conversations that are happening in the room. She has shared her unique approach to scribing with thousands of visual practitioners around the world. And again, because she doesn't like to plug herself, I'll go ahead and do that. She has something called a system scribing lab that's coming up in March. And I'll go ahead and share the link to that in chat. I haven't done it myself. I've been a little busy, but I've got a lot of colleagues who have taken it and they give rave reviews, okay? So with that, I'm very pleased to turn this over to Kelvy Bird and make sure everybody on the line, make sure you've got something to draw with. We're going to be practicing tonight. And with that, Kelvy, over to you.
Yeah, Brian, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. I'm really, really honored to be part of this and really happy to see a lot of new faces and also people who care about scribing and facilitation and growing our field of practice. And just as I kind of frame everything that I do a little bit in a meta way, which is that, you know, I always say there's no good or bad drawing because all drawings help people see. And I've been feeling pretty strongly lately about, just feeling strongly, given what's happening in the state of things in the US and in the world and the rate of change in terms of environmental collapse. And I'm a bit of a extremist, and so my rational mind kicks in and says, you know, yeah, but there have always been things that humans have faced and that the planet has faced, but I've been feeling it really strongly lately. And the one thing that really seems to be keeping me, I guess, above water is the hope and the promise that I feel in our field of practice with people drawing and helping other people understand where we are and see the real situation of the current conditions and also see the promise of a future that we might be able to create together. So I'll just toss that in as something to consider behind everything I'll share tonight is that anytime we can understand a dynamic of a system a little bit more clearly and help others to see that more clearly, in my mind, is a good thing. So here's to us seeing more clearly together. So I will first talk, I have some slides and I'll share them now without it being like too heavy with slides, but I think it might help to just explain where I'm coming from. So let me do that. Okay. And how is this? Can everyone see all right? I'm gonna see if I have to do the full screen. Okay. So this is just an overview of what we'll be going through tonight. I'll spend about half an hour on a little bit on my practice, walking through the levels of scribing framework that I've written up about. And then we'll have some time in breakouts to reflect on that, and then time for questions on that framework. Then we'll dive into the system scribing piece where I'll explain a bit about the history, or I mean, it's not a grand history, it's like a couple year history of how it came to be. Then we'll have some practice, again, breakouts, and then questions, and that will be the flow of this. I do have a bunch of resources that I'm happy to share after this is over, and based on the questions that come up, we'll see what other types of resources or notes of other people, or other places to look for more information. So a little bit on my background. I love this slide because this is me and my brother when we were, I don't know, what was I, 4 or something? I don't really remember, but this is behind my dad's house in the woods in the Hudson Valley in New York State, where I grew up. And you can see this was a picnic. We were out on some rock. I'm eating, of course, and not even aware of the camera. But the reason I love this is because I grew up immersed in the woods, and I grew up immersed in nature. And we would just be out randomly in the woods like this on any given day or on the weekends. And my sense of how things fit together and my sense of coherence comes from this time, really. So it comes from my being in nature, feeling it, not aware necessarily of how branches went together or how leaves fell on the ground or moss grew on the rocks. It was just this feeling that I'm held in this place is safe, and the complexity was natural. It wasn't anything that I'm, to make sense of even, it just was. I went on to study art in college, painting, and this is a close-up of a painting that I've been working on recently. It's only 12 inches square. I never share my paintings online, but I thought I would just go for it because there's something about density and complexity that I really love, and I kind of can't escape. And my paintings are more about the inner world and coming from a more emotional place, but they all also have to do with the human condition. So here's a picture where you can see them in scale on a wall. And when you see them in series, there's this effect of things coming at you or receding. And I like to think that elements of my scribing have the same effect, even though it's a completely different context. This art making, this painting, it's infused in my scribing. No one ever knows it, but it is infused in my scribing the same way the woods are infused in my scribing, or nature is. So here's a picture, just for those of you who aren't familiar with my work, of this was a session I did at MIT where I was drawing. Each of these boards is about 4 by 8 feet and drawn with the Neuland markers, just ink markers. And each one was about 3 hours of content. So a high level of synthesis. And you can see there's some illustration, there's some connections. When I clean it up, I put in more hierarchies of backgrounds for the larger sections. But just to give a sense of what my work looks like, also in series, right? So it's consistent with my painting in a way. Okay, so now I will jump into the levels of scribing, which, can everyone still see this okay? Like, yeah, okay, cool. So I also really love to swim, and near me there's a pond called Walden Pond, and in the summer I go swimming in it, and At some point I was trying to liken levels of scribing to the experience of swimming in the pond, because I can explain it the way I've written it in the book. But again, to kind of feel it is a little more, I don't know, I like bringing it back to the pond. So at one level, for levels of scribing, there's mirroring, which is direct reflecting back, which is like you see it. Well, I'll go into this more with pictures. The second level is differentiating, where you start to see parts. The third is connecting, where things start to come together. And the fourth is revealing, where you start to see things that might come from below that aren't so obvious right at the front when you listen to something or notice something. So level one, as I said, is mirroring. This is where you hear a word and you make a picture. So this is very familiar to most scribes. And when you think of the pond, it's like this, like you see the surface of the pond, it's literally mirroring the clouds and the trees around the pond. And it's got this clear view of the top. And if you never go in the water, you could still appreciate the top of the pond. In scribing, it might look something like this, where you see these parts. Oops, I should not move my mouse. So this was a lightning talk where each presentation was about 5 minutes. I tried to capture each one discreetly. So each one was on its own, and I didn't try to make any connection between the different parts. So I would say this is a very crisp level one scribing example. Level two is where we start to differentiate. So we start to interpret words and we start to make sense of things, and we start to notice what things look like in relation to each other, but they're still separate. So one might be larger, one idea might have more prominence, one idea might be smaller. Coming back to the pond, this is where we start to see how within the surface of the pond, even if you go to the edge, we see the rocks, we see the little blades of grass, we see a log, we see the water. We're still not really in it, but we're starting to look more closely at what comprises the surface. And in scribing, it might look something like this, where this was a panel conversation and there were, I think, 4 or 5 people speaking. Again, like I broke it out into separate parts, like the lightning talks, but there's a little more definition around each one, and there's a little more room for possibility of things relating to each other, but I still leave things in their place. Level 3 is where we start to connect things, where we can relate ideas and make meaning. In the pond, it might start looking like this, where instead of just looking at the surface, we can look down, and we're starting to see like some of the wet grasses from the bottom that might relate in their shape to the drier grasses that are on top and brighter green. So one might be more soggy and darker green, and one might be brighter. We can see, I wish I could like draw over this, but I'm afraid to even touch my mouse, but there are little sticks in here that you can see. So there's the one log and then little sticks, and those relate in a way because they're similar, even though they're placed in different places. And you start to really see how things overlap and are part of the same. There's much less separation than when we're looking purely at the surface. And here's an example where I was scribing and there were three opening sections to one like conference, and I could have drawn them all differently, but they related, and so you can see the arrows along the side were a way to try to connect the content between it. So on the far left we have something that came out at the end was shaping society by coming together, but somehow that connects into the first part that I was drawing, which was around big picture issues and the story of the rice, which is in the bottom center. So it kind of created a loop. So I kind of created a loop out of how it was being presented. And that's what it looked like cleaned up, where I was just able to differentiate the parts a little bit more, which was giving a little bit of level 2 emphasis while still sustaining the connections. And then level 4 I have in the book surface, but I've gotten a lot of feedback that that's a confusing word for people because it's not really a verb. So here I have reveal. So the main thing about level 4 scribing is trying to let something come through that is not obvious right away. And it requires slowing down and looking more closely and being still and having a greater sense of timelessness almost. And there's a whole video, which I won't play, but this is a still shot from the video where somebody went into Walden Pond, and this is at the bottom of the pond. So I actually really, really love this. And in the video, you don't see the fish, but all of a sudden you're just noticing the water and the flow of the water, and then all of a sudden fish come by. And that's how it feels for me in level 4 scribing or generative scribing, when you think the conversation's just going along, and then all of a sudden something will come up and like it hits you in your heart or somewhere in your body, and you think like, oh, like that's exactly the thing. That's it. Like that's the thing that wants to be seen today, like the most important thing, like the fish. So this would be an example of level 4 scribing, but also you can see the other levels embedded. So it's not that we're only ever scribing one level at a time. Ideally, I think we develop so that we can embed them within each other, or play the different levels together. But this, I think, would be more of an example where you could see some things coming through, maybe in like the sort of horizontal root system that weren't even named or spoken, but it felt like it was part of what the session was about. So I drew them in. And this is chalk on a chalkboard. So again, overview of the levels: mirroring, you hear a word, you make a picture. Differentiate, you interpret words, you make sense. Connect, relate ideas and make meaning. And surface, we'll say, which is to reveal the essence and make known. Okay, so that felt very long. So I wonder at this point, I wanted to go into a breakout. And I think before we have questions for me, I would love it if everyone had time to just digest this a little bit together and share any impressions, any confusion, any insights with each other. So what Brian will set everyone into breakouts, and what we would invite you to do is introduce yourself, your name and where you're from, and then how do the levels of scribing relate to your work as a scribe, a facilitator, a coach, or whatever your work may be. So name, place, and what about this model? How can it work for you, or what makes sense? What doesn't make sense? Well, welcome back. I hope you had a productive or insightful 8 to 10 minutes there. So I wonder, yes, thumbs up. Maybe what we can do now is if people have questions, you can enter it into the chat window. Or if anybody has a question they'd like to ask, I guess there's the hand raise feature, or you could just visually raise your hand and come off mute, and then we can answer some questions. Anybody have any questions? Casey.
How did you get started doing this, Kelly?
So I started, I studied art, like I said, at school. And then I was in San Francisco and completely broke, like, no life as an artist. And somehow I was working on a collaborative art project with some friends from college who were architects. And then I was working for someone who was doing named Christopher Allen, who was doing collaborative design. And this was in 1988 or so before everything was digital, but I had an America Online account. And Christopher knew some people, Matt and Gail Taylor, who led design shops. And when they came to San Francisco, I met them and they were interested in my collaborative art project and invited me to support a design shop. which is a collaboratively supported event for releasing what they called Group Genius. So that's really the way that I got started in about 1989 or so, 1990, something like that, the early 90s. And actually, no, I think it was like 94. And then I started working with them and started scribing. But I will say it took me a good solid 2 years before I started scribing because I'm so shy. I was even shyer then. And I was terrified to draw in front of people. But I did a lot of journaling and a lot of visual note taking to sort of build up my vocabulary and my own language for it. Marceline?
Marceline, thank you. How to try, appreciate that.
I saw Muddy had a raised hand. Or okay, anyway, okay.
So I just wanted to ask, you know, you're getting up there and you're depicting the systems that you're hearing. And I'm imagining at some point the customer comes back to you and said, that's not the system we work in. That's not our environment. So how do you work with that for them? What is probably, it's an epiphany, but they're maybe not ready to see it. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so I've never gotten that feedback, mainly because I think I don't emphasize that I'm trying to represent a system. So in my mind or in my being, I think I'm trying to recreate the experience of the woods, where just everything fits together, you know, and it feels intact. Like there aren't loose ends. There aren't pieces that are floating that are unattached. Everything relates somehow. And so I have this systems approach that no one has ever said that's not what we were talking about, but they probably were being polite. If that were to happen, I would take it as welcome correction. So that means I missed something, you know, I didn't hear something accurately, or, and I don't mean to say like no one's given me that feedback, like I get the systems right. I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's mostly that people aren't aware that I'm trying to represent a system. So there's nothing to give feedback on, if that makes sense. So I'll answer one from the chat and then we can go. Oh, sure. Yeah. I hope that helps. From Mateo, do I decide which level to work towards, or is it emergent, or does it depend on what I've contracted for? So this is another case where I don't usually contract around a certain level of scribing. It's a tool in my tool chest that I know going in. I try to get a sense of the appetite of the client. Do I think they'll want to go deep or broad, or does this need to look very good and be very sharp and crisp? Like the MIT examples I showed you of the tall drawings, that needs to be data rich and accurate. They don't want any big epiphanies coming, you know, it's not generative at all. It's mostly factual. So I don't really contract around that. And if something deeper comes out, it would be emergent. Yeah. And other times I feel like there are high expectations on emergence. Like when I'm working with the Presencing Institute, I feel like people are always wanting me to do something really big and spacious and meaningful, and that the pressure's really on those sessions. Because then if I don't come up with anything, it's a big disappointment. Okay, Muddy.
Follow-up question for that? Sorry, I'm just
Sure.
wondering, is there a point when you're like talking to your clients where you're asking very specific questions to clarify that in advance?
I think if I were aware of this framework when I started, I probably would try to have a conversation with clients, or at least know that I could if they were interested in understanding my approach. I think I don't do it so much now. Honestly, I'm a really quiet scribe. Like I just follow, like I let the client tell me what the situation is, what they need. And then I go in and I just figure it out for myself and then decide how far I can stretch the boundaries, which is we'll come to in the system scribing part in a few minutes too. So I don't know, I don't challenge the clients really verbally because, I don't know, I just think, one, I don't really have the energy for it. Two, I'd rather conserve my energy for trying to make the best drawing possible. And if I can somehow expand the mental models or like the way people are thinking by the drawing, like through the drawing, that to me is a success. It's not always in a conversation with the client. Probably could be a little more muddy. And then I'll head into the system scribing tools.
Awesome. Kelvy, thanks so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. We had a great little small group discussion, and something occurred to me around the levels that we work at, and when I have a chance to share the graphic back with the group, those deeper levels of connection and revealing come through because I can share them in a way that might not be obvious if someone was just looking at the graphic itself, right? So those higher levels are more obvious, right, from the observer standpoint. So my question is around how often or how much of this work is really that silent scribe. You're drawing and, you know, it goes to the lobby and people can see it, but you're not really sharing that live in the group, and how do these deeper levels, you know, emerge, or for the groups to get the full value out of those if it's not kind of shared live? And I don't know if that makes sense, but just trying
Absolutely.
to.
Yeah. I also, in some situations with some clients, they ask me to share back at the end and then some don't. And maybe this is my painting background, especially as an abstract painter. I think there's part of me that never expects people to understand. I mean, it's my own weakness, but I just have this belief that people will get it when they get it. And that people who are ready to experience something at a deeper level will, and that's okay. I've had issues with my neck for years, and a long time ago I went to a chiropractor, and you know, I was like really, I could barely move my neck, and I went down on the table, and you know, she was like doing the massage stuff, and then she said, "Okay, are you ready for the adjustment?" And I was ready for her to do everything, you know, to hear like the like the whole thing crack, and she just went like tink. It was like the teeniest little, and she said, "That's all your system can take right now." She was like, "That's all your system can. That's as much change as your neck can take right now, and you know, do these stretches and come back, and we'll work a little more." And that said a lot to me, because that's how it is sometimes with clients or systems where they can get to a certain point, and then you know, you have to let things breathe. Like we don't rush like a growing season, you know, like fruit on a tree, it blossoms, it has its winter, its dormancy, and then it blossoms, and then, you know, it has the elements, and then it produces fruit. And I think it's like that with you know, if our images are like the fruit in some way, people come to it in different seasons, if that makes sense.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'll take just a couple more questions from the chat and then carry on with the system scribing bit. The words generative and emergent, and something about epiphany. So so generative, yeah, when I'm describing this, I did use the term based on Otto Scharmer's work and his use of generative in terms of listening. And that's where my use of the word comes from. My interpretation of the word is that it's like compost. It's the heat. It's like when something comes through that is a result of like a field of connections existing. So once a certain, like a social field is activated, like the people are connected in a certain way, and hearts are activated and minds are open, then there's like this bubbling effect of it's so weird. I can feel it in my body and I can't always give good language to it, but it's like this opening, you know. I don't know if this is like, maybe it's like the feeling like when you fall in love and or you see a child or a loved one and you just have like your being just kind of opens. Let's hope with your loved ones that happens, or with someone you can remember, a grandmother or someone who really loved you. When you're with them, your being kind of opens. And in my mind, that's a generative quality, when possibility, we have a sense of possibility. And then in that space, like, things come alive. I don't know. I don't think that's a very good description, but let's go with that for now. And then in terms of my epiphanies, and do I check them with the group? Usually not. But I will say, with age, it has come with age. I did not trust myself as much when I was younger. So now I'm almost 54. And I've been scribing since I was in my late 20s. And no, I did not ever, I would always second guess myself then. But now if I feel something, I trust it a lot more. And I think that's experience and age, and I don't know. But do I share it with the client if they ask? But again, I keep to myself a lot more than people probably think. Okay, and one last one, and then I'll move on. This is if you have the depth of listening, but an unrefined artistic ability. Oh yeah, that would be me. How to best cultivate that skill. I would say just draw. So if you are a strong listener and a strong sense maker, that's like 85% of the work, maybe 90% of the work. And the drawing, that's practice. Like the first time I scribed, I was asked to sit down because I was just writing a list of words over and over in one color. And the facilitator tapped me on the shoulder and she said, "You can sit down now." You know, it's because I was not adding any value, but I didn't really understand I was supposed to be drawing things, and I don't have a good image recall. So truthfully, if somebody says cat, I was talking about this today with somebody, if somebody says cat, I don't know what a cat looks like. Like my brain doesn't work in that way. So I have to look it up on my phone to draw a cat. I know what a cat feels like the experience of cat I could represent, but how a cat looks is a challenge for me. So it's just honestly, it's practice. The drawing is practice, like at every occasion possible, and with different tools, different surfaces, different scales, different contexts, different audiences, all of that. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the system scribing piece. And for this, I will go back to some slides. But first I'll start just by saying, I think Jessica's on the line. I saw her earlier, but I don't see her in view, but I think she's still here. Jessica Reel is my, what's the word? Your co-conspirator, or, you know, the person, my partner in crime. And the history of how systems scribing has come along is that I have been obsessed with systems thinking since maybe 2011, when I was in a situation and I had to scribe the housing crisis, the global financial collapse and the housing crisis. And I didn't understand it that well. And so I did some research to try to understand it, because I had about 15 minutes to create the map on a big wall. And as I was scribing, I had this sinking feeling in my stomach that I'm part of this system, right? Like, it's so easy to scribe and think it's out there. What they're talking about is something else. but I saw myself in the picture. I was a homeowner. I wasn't underwater with my mortgage, but I did have this American dream of, you know, my life would be enriched if I owned a home. And so I was kind of in that picture. And then I realized I need to understand how I'm part of the picture and how am I representing these pictures from the inside out, not just from the outside in. And that was the beginning of my own curiosity really being piqued. And I'm lucky because I live near MIT, where there's been like one big group of systems thinkers, and the field of system dynamics really started here at MIT. And I've been very fortunate to be in situations with some of these professors to learn about systems thinking, at least this kind of systems thinking here, and also scribe for them. Jessica has had another entry into the field, and we actually co-wrote a chapter that's coming up that will be published in a book probably next year, and we can share an excerpt of that chapter afterwards with you, so you can have more sense of what led up to what I think now is this emerging field of practice called systems scribing. So really, systems scribing is the intersection of scribing as we know it, of reflecting back what people are saying real time, with systems thinking. And I won't go too much into like a definition of systems thinking because it is in the article. And what I'd like to do is go through like elements that Jessica and I have come up with that we think help define systems scribing in practice. And I'll go through, there are 6 elements, and I'll go through them and then show examples. And then I have one scribed image, and I'll go into that and show examples of each of the different elements. And then we'll have a bit of a practice round together where everybody can draw. Am I missing something? Oh, I guess just the presencing work comes into it too. So in part, the systems scribing, it is more of a mental capacity, but it does also bring in an internal knowing, like that sense of coherence that I've already spoken to, of being in the woods, like that interior knowing, I think is more of the presencing piece that can come in, more of a, awareness and mindfulness. And that somehow merges in us with the more conceptual way of identifying aspects of systems. And then our hand, which is the part that then draws it. Okay, cool. So in systems scribing, this is the image that's in my book that might be more familiar to people for the levels of scribing. And systems scribing comes right at this juncture between levels 2 and levels 3, where we have our different parts identified and we start connecting them. And it's a structural element, like this is a structural part. The generative scribing at the base is more energetic, and the system scribing is a more structural approach. So the 6 key elements, these are a little more than 6, but are parts, wholes, relationships, boundaries, perspectives, and patterns. Those are the ones that I'll focus on. And to help with those, like to help identify things, we might annotate, which is just labeling things with words, and in all of these elements together combine to make a system. So I'll go through them one by one. So first we have parts, and parts are the elements that are within a system. They can be people, ideas, or things, and a scribe could represent these with shapes, images, or keywords. So these are really the individual pieces of a system. The next are wholes, which are the groupings of parts that comprise the system. So wholes can be organizations or elements of an ecosystem, technologies, or pieces of knowledge. And a scribe can draw these with lines or frames around the parts to indicate a whole. So you can see with this darker circle here that it's going around those 3 smaller parts inside. So that grouping is a whole. Then we have relationships, pretty intuitive. Relationships are interactions between the parts and the wholes that hold the system together. So without the relationships, we have these isolated pieces. So we could use, to identify relationships, we can use arrows, lines, and then proximity. So sometimes it's not just with an arrow, but you see the two like circles on the right side, those, you're showing the relationship by one thing being inside another. And you could even see like the dark shape or the white as, you know, a play on the relationship of the parts. Then we have boundaries, which is the parameter of a system, and it determines what's in or out. So sometimes in systems thinking, as I know it, we'll say the boundary of your model, of your mental model, which, so in scribing, it can be a physical boundary, so it can be a visual boundary. It could also represent the boundary of our thinking. So how far out are we thinking, or how closed in? And we can represent this with frames or borders, different colors, sizes of shapes, textures, and sometimes with layout choice. And I have this all written up, so I know I'm going fairly quickly, but I have a handout where this is all spelled out and everybody can have it afterwards. The next element would be patterns. And patterns are behaviors that happen over time or space. So when things repeat or things change over time, that would be a pattern. So here you can see, and this wasn't obvious when you first look at the whole drawing, but the pattern of circle in a circle, right? And so you see how the relationship is changing between one circle and the inner circle and the outer circle throughout the drawing. There's no time associated with this, but you can see the pattern of the relationship change. And then the last one is perspective, which is the views within a system. So this is really, it's the perspectives that we notice in the room as people are talking, and it's also the awareness of our perspective. So what's our bias as we encounter the drawing, and what lens are we bringing to the situation? And we can represent the perspective with annotations, so words that help describe it, and also placing sections of content in relation to one another to illuminate the perspectives. So here you can see this is kind of a person with very large arms from above, and you can see that this shape has a perspective where it's looking in on the rest of the drawing. But it also has its back to the edge of the frame, so there's something that it's not seeing behind it. And I might write, I wouldn't annotate it at all. Nobody would know what I meant by this, but okay, so, or maybe they would, I don't know. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is walk through, everybody's still here, is walk through an example and show you, I did not do this thinking about these 6 elements. So these elements are something that Jessica and I like decoded from our own work and our own thinking process, and then wrote about to try to help clarify. So the drawing I'm about to show you was in a systems thinking context, but not with these different elements in mind, but I'm going to try to walk you through it just to show that I'm pretty sure any drawing any of you have done, you could find these elements in your drawing. All right, now let me bring up this other one. Okay, can everyone see this okay? Yes. All right, so this was done on a dry erase board. It was about 4 by 8 feet, and it was done for a professor named John Sturman, who leads the System Dynamics group at MIT, and it's a climate simulation, and this was from 2015, and my heart broke scribing this, which is one of the reasons I love the drawing so much, because it was another one of these aha moments, which I'll get into as I go through. So, parts. We could see the parts as that's a part, that's a part. Those are 2 parts. So I'm only using one brush size for speeding up, but so that might be a hole, but actually, let me change this so I don't confuse things. Okay, so that's a part, that's a part, that's a part, that's a part, right? I think you get the picture. That would be a part, right? One sentence that he said. Those are all parts. Okay. Now for the holes, I would say that's a hole because it's a grouping of parts of a cascading effect. Another hole would be, it's conceptual, but here where this was talking about agricultural crop yield being a threat to business, which would cause human migration. So that involves relationships, but in my mind, that was a whole. And then this is definitely a whole, like this whole map of the carbon emissions and the consequence of the rising temperatures. So that was that was really a, ooh, I should save this for a pattern, but visually that was a whole in my mind. Another whole, this whole section was a whole. So holes kind of also indicate sections of the layout, right? That's a whole, and this was probably a whole. That whole thing was a whole. Okay, then we've got, oh, I would encourage everyone, if questions come up, keep going in the chat window, even though I can't see it because we can bring that back in later. Then we have relationships. Now relationships, my stuff is usually loaded with relationships. Obviously, all the arrows, that relates, okay, it was this awful thing where that happens, that's not a relationship, but like, let's say that's a part, and because the CO2 goes up, the stock, or the amount of CO2 in the air, in the atmosphere, goes up. That relates to ocean acidification, which relates to the food supply, which relates to the reefs, which relates to temperature increase, which relates to sea level rise, which relates to ice sheets melting, which relates to freshwater stress, which relates to drought, which relates to that, which relates. The entire thing is a cascade of relationships. And then human migration, that's where I cried, because I never really understood I never thought that the consequence of climate change would be people being massively dislocated. So that was a huge awakening. Okay, so those are some relationships. You can see visually that like this relates to this, which relates to this, which relates to this, because they're clustered on one side. And even though they have some arrows connecting them, really it was more a matter of these things all relate to each other because that's the possible like hope. Like that's the only element where there was hope in this whole picture. Okay. Relationships, boundaries. Well, visually there are some boundaries, which would be this in a way is about, this timeline is a boundary for all of that, right? And I would say also that this line here is a boundary for all of this. So what I've just highlighted is a potential future, and this is all current reality, or pretty much like current and future reality. And so you see how that this one line was kind of a boundary between those two views. Okay. Perspectives, again, we would say like this is the perspective of doom. We're playing Russian roulette. That was a big, you know, perspective. And then challenge mental models and educate. That's a perspective. Build social political movements. That's a perspective. Our behavior can reverse the trend. That was a perspective. So I brought them in mostly, it was mostly the presenter's perspective, right? Okay, and then we've got patterns. The last one, we could see I would say the visual pattern again was my use of ovals for that, to show that they all related. I used the same shape. And oh boy, you know, to be honest, I'd have to, I don't want to just make something up. I'd have to look at this a little more to find the pattern, but definitely in terms of the content, this maps a pattern in the content. So these are visual patterns, and this is a pattern that was revealed in the actual presentation itself, like that. Those are all, you know, patterns. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. Oh my God, this is exhausting looking at these pictures. Okay, so at this point, I think I am wondering, I do have a practice, but I have an inclination because I've been talking so much just to check and see if there are any, like 1 or 2 key questions for clarification, and then we'll do the practice together. And I can look at the chat too. Yes, more resources for systems thinking. We can share a bibliography. And Jessica already said that. Okay. There's a boundary around what's mentioned and what isn't. For example, consumption culture is not mentioned and it's outside the boundary. Exactly. It's outside the boundary of the picture. Exactly. So consumption culture was not mentioned, even though I was aware of it and the professor was aware of it. And because it wasn't mentioned, I didn't include it in the picture. And that's a choice. Like that's something when we're scribing, if we become aware of perspectives, we face a choice of what to include and what not to include. And to some extent, it has to do with honoring who's speaking and not putting words in people's mouths, but really trying to be respectful of what is being conveyed. Is there another question maybe from somebody verbally if you know? Okay, so we can go into the practice now. Oh, Claire, did you have a question? No, okay.
There's one from Melissa Kelvy. How do you scribe and capture when you don't know what's going to be talked about?
Yeah, I'm going to hold on to that because it's not directly related to clarifying the elements. So I was just trying to focus on clarifying the actual tool that we're about to use. And it seems like for now it's clear enough. And these questions we'll also get to after, hopefully. Okay, so I have a video that I am going to try to play, and I think it's about 4 or 5 minutes long, and I think I'll play it once because of time, and the only instruction is try to consider these different elements. So the parts, the wholes, the relationships, the boundaries, the perspectives, and the patterns. And if you can't remember all 6 of them, don't worry about it. Think about the parts and the relationships, and that's it. So while you're drawing to this video, just be a little bit more aware of how you're identifying things in the content to show how they relate. Okay? So to preface it, I'll say that this is someone named Larry McLeaf, and he's an Inuit, I think you say it. He's from Salmon Nation, which is in northern Canada. It's really like the Galapagos of the north, he says. So it's the islands that are way, way off the coast of Western Canada. And he's talking, I'll let you see what he's talking about, but that's something on Larry. And let's see if I can get this to work. All right, here we go.
I think we need serious deliberative processes that are taking stock of what we have wrought as a humankind, why we have come to where we are today, doing real soul searching into us as human beings, as what it is, what have we created, why have we created this, and what's the root cause, not the surface. It's important to deal with the surface, with all the programs to try to have, environmental protection of lands and restoration programs and all those kinds of things. But no one is saying, well, yeah, but what caused that? What consciousness caused that kind of destruction? And how did that consciousness get created? And by asking those questions, then maybe we can get to some of the solutions for ourselves. We shouldn't be out there studying environment. We should be studying ourselves. One time an elder said, they were putting radio tags on a walrus to try to locate their migratory and feeding patterns. And the elder said, they're not trying to understand the walrus. They're trying to find out who they are, meaning the scientists, which in some ways is true. We're looking in the wrong direction. So I think that we definitely need to have deliberative processes and dialogue between people of many different perspectives, many different worldviews. And we also need to consider gender balance. In the Western society, we're predominantly working with male constructs, masculine constructs, top-down organizations, command and control, manage, linear, numerically based. And so we need that feminine perspective, if you will. And we need to have the balance and be able to understand, and to be able to understand how to listen. In Western society, what I found, and it's shocking actually sometimes, even to me, having so much exposure in the Western world, is to watch these TV talk shows. And there are people talking over each other. They're not listening. What they're doing is they're hearing what the other person says and thinking about what is going to be my response to that, rather than simply listening to what you're saying. And so the deliberative process requires real listening, sitting back without agenda to hear what the other person is saying.
Okay, so I know that was very fast. I can also share the link to that if you're curious to hear it again. But for now, because of time, I think we'll move into the next breakout, Brian, and give everyone a chance to, I think you'll be with new people, and let's do breakouts of 4 again. And really just, I will try to keep it shorter. We'll try to keep it just to about, just under 8 minutes. So again, like a minute or 2 to share. And you can either introduce yourself and where you're from, and then share something on what of the elements or what of system scribing you were able to catch while you were listening and drawing. And again, Brian will set you off into the breakouts. You just need to click accept to be moved into one. And then we'll give you a 1-minute warning when you are about to come back. And then after the breakouts, we'll spend the rest of the time on a Q&A. All right, I think everyone's back. Welcome back. So again, if you have questions that came up in the breakouts, you can either type them into the chat or raise your hand or raise a drawing of a hand. And yes, Anik.
So our group, which was Hank, Jennifer, and Mark, had some really interesting, we wondered about the fact that the short clip, he was talking about pain points, the pain of climate destruction, the pain of monocultural thinking and too much gender inequity. And we were talking about how, and I was thinking about how you said in your book, when you scribe, you actually pause and you don't immediately start drawing. and you wait to hear the context. And I was thinking about how with some of these big wicked problems like climate destruction, you're not waiting for a quick snap, black and white answer, but you are waiting for some kind of redemptive, where are we going? So that if you draw it up on the board, you're not emphasizing the pain, but you're going, okay, but we're heading towards, so that people don't suffer empathy fatigue right away by quickly putting up all the wrong stuff on the board. And I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I don't think of it as wrong or right, or that something painful would be like wrong and I wouldn't want it up, and something like hopeful is right. And I didn't mean to imply that if I did, but I leave space. So one of the reasons I go slowly when I scribe is to leave space for a bigger picture, so I don't get trapped by having too much of any one perspective, and I leave room for other perspectives to come in as they come in. So I try to go really slowly, which is why I pause. And usually if we'd been in a workshop doing this, I would have had everybody slow way down before starting to draw, but we're on a webinar.
So I will just show you real quick. I only have
a couple minutes, so I just want to make sure if there are other questions, but if it's something that, to clarify your point, yeah.
That all I had time to draw was Ruth.
Yeah. Well, it was only 4 minutes. So I think that's a lot to have drawn anyway. Were there other questions that somebody would like to bring in?
Can I just talk it? Oh, okay, sorry.
Marguerite and then Amy, yeah.
Yeah, I keep wondering, how do you approach the paper? You have this big blank paper, and where do you make your first mark? Sort of judging over time how things get filled up and move around the space.
Yeah, I would say it's completely intuitive. And for me, if I'm really nervous, I'll start left to right, which is just a normal writing direction for us in the Western, for many of us. But I never go left to right. I never start on the left without considering the right. I'm always considering the whole thing, regardless of where I start. And even with system scribing or generative scribing, it's intuitive. It's almost like if you're going around a pond and there's no beach, you need to choose an entry point. So, or you're going to a beach and you're sitting down for the day, you choose a spot on the beach. It's kind of like that. It's what feels right. The next question was from Amy.
I'm just wondering how much you think about these components as you're scribing.
That's a really good question. Since Jessica and I wrote the article, after we had a few practice workshops, I've been thinking about it a lot more. And again, it depends on the situation, because I tend to get very nervous when I scribe. And so sometimes I'm literally just trying to get through and I don't give it that much thought. But I think that they're kind of internalized in me. So I think I'm doing it without consciously doing it because I've been doing it for so long. But when I am paying more attention, you have to slow down. Like you have to give yourself space to be thoughtful about it. Otherwise, you're just in a reactive mode, like drawing everything we can draw everything we hear, which is just like chasing a fast car instead of being intentional about the turns we want to be making. Are there any other questions?
I have one.
Andrea, yeah.
Yeah, so my question is, so I know some people who are able to listen really well and remember the words people use or the concepts, but specifically the exact words, and they place them visually in a field around them. Like they've trained themselves to do that. And so I'm using that as sort of a frame to ask you, as you are listening and you are slowing down, what is it that, or where is it that you put the things that you're hearing while you're making sense?
So depending on the density of the session, I will sometimes take notes, but I don't take that many notes, only if there's something that I really think needs to be noted that I don't want to forget, because I tend to forget more things now than when I was younger. Or I've just been doing this so long, my brain is saturated. I'm not sure which, but I have to say honestly that I hold a lot of it in my head. And if it falls away, I let it fall away, but if it's like one of the MIT sessions where I know there's specific content, like a professor puts up a slide, I'll take a picture of the slide so that I can go back to the detail if I need to. So I try to have very key content written down in case I want to include it, but I also am very forgiving with myself. Yeah. So at this point, I'm mindful of the time, and I'm available for more questions. So if you have questions, maybe, I don't know the best. Oh, well, one of the things that I'll give you some follow-up of how we can address questions, but first, or maybe I'll go through my ending stuff, Brian, and then turn it over to you for, okay, great. So as Brian opened with initially, Jessica and I are leading a system scribing lab, which is a full 4-week dive into this territory. So this was a really light kind of overview, and we'll have a 4-week program that's coming up. It's starting in about 2 weeks, and there's more information for that online if you're interested in that. And then probably the only in-person workshop that I'll be doing this year, unfortunately, or for some fortunately, will be in Berlin, which will be in March, I think towards the end of March. And that will be 5 days of five different modules. And there's also information about that on my website, and we can send a follow-up with a link to that. And one of those will be on system scribing. Another thing I have noted to remind everybody about is just practice. Like, there's something, I did see a comment in the chat window about feedback. Like, the only way we can really learn and grow our practice is with feedback, like either our own reflection and giving ourselves, not feedback like criticism of like, this is good, this isn't good, but reflection so that we can learn from what we're doing, and like a rigor with reflection so that, you know, like when I was going through the image and I couldn't clearly identify the patterns, I would want to reflect and take a little more time with that drawing to see, like, did I include patterns or not? And if I were to do it again, what might be patterns that I could include? So just encourage everybody to practice. And in the spirit of sharing, we have in the visual practice community, we have a Mighty Network online platform where we've been hosting our programs, and also it's a general space where people can connect and share work. And the reason we're doing it is because I'm really trying to get off Facebook and looking for alternatives to that. And so far, the Mighty Network seems to be, it's one alternative. And so I'm happy to invite everyone into that space where you can continue to share your work and learn from others who are also curious about system scribing and generative scribing. That's it.
How would one join the Mighty Network?
I can send an invitation.
Oh, you're going to send that?
Yeah, I can send an invitation. Mm-hmm. And
okay.
Yeah, it's
okay.
And thank you.
Thanks, everybody. So, Kelvy, thank you so much. I mean, let's show some appreciation for Kelvy. NOVA Scribes review snaps. So, thank you so much for that. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And again, thank you so much. This has been amazing.